Great. So this semester we have a program which involves 15 seminars and 30 speakers. We will talk about art and morality, creativity, multisensory perception, music, and many more. As usual, we invite two speakers who present two different approaches to one question in art and aesthetics. And today is our opening seminar, and we will discuss what is art and how we can define art. First, our speakers will give their talks, and after that, we will start the discussion. So during the discussion, everyone will have a chance to ask a question or comment. Our first speaker is Dr. Dhanraj Vishwanath, a senior lecturer at the School of Psychology and Neuroscience, University of St. Andrews. Dr. Vishwanath has a background in art and architecture, and his main research interests involve 3D space and object perception. He applies his research in visual perception to aesthetics and design. Dr. Vishwanath, thank you very much for accepting our invitation. We look forward to your talk. Feel free to share your screen whenever you are ready.
Okay. Thanks very much, Marina, and also Nicole for inviting me. And it's great to be here with Fulvia. Looking forward to her talk. All right, so I'll go ahead and share my screen. Can everyone see that?
Yes.
Okay, I'm just gonna.
Great.
Okay. All right. Great. So, okay, so the seminar today. Oh, just a minute. I have to turn on I forgot what I just tested earlier.
No worries, take your time.
Yeah. Okay, let me do that again. Share content and turn on the sound. Okay, hopefully you can all see that. Okay, yes. So obviously the seminar is starting with a very, very big question. What is art? It's a big and complex question, and I think there are three ways in which it can be answered. The first is from the ontological standpoint, which is where we might define art in terms of the attributes that make something art, the features that constitute it, the intent behind it, the contexts that it is presented in. Another way we might define art is from a sociological standpoint, where we define art in terms of the sociological role that it plays, or it should play, or perhaps it has played. The third viewpoint is that of the psychological viewpoint. And here we might define art in terms of the psychological processes and products that it engenders. In this presentation, I'm going to attempt to answer the question from the psychological standpoint. In trying to answer this question from a psychological standpoint, however, we are confronted with an immense complexity of the domain. So even if we restricted ourselves to Western art of the last 150 years, we see the immense complexity of what is counted as art. So where do we start? Well, as in all psychological theorizing, we must begin with a first-person introspection. But art, unfortunately, presents a further complication in that we have two possible introspective accounts that we can take into consideration: the introspective account of the art viewer or the introspective account of the artist. Now, since most philosophers and psychologists are not artists, the default has been to take the introspective viewpoint of the art observer. And a lot of theorizing of the last 2 decades has relied on an art viewer-centered introspection. And coming out of this theorizing, there seem to be a few recurring themes that have arisen. So the first is this idea that art and aesthetic experience is characterized by a cognitive achievement. And this is described or characterized in many different ways. For example, understanding, interpretation, explanatory resolution or meaning construction, aha or Leibniz, problem solving, evaluation, revealing of essences or alternate realities. Another related theme is the idea that we have this intrinsic difficulty, complexity, indeterminacy, and instability in a lot of art, which creates an anticipation of insight in the viewer. And both this anticipation and its fulfillment are somehow hedonically marked, leading to a positive experience, which in psychology we would consider a reward experience. Now, these theories that originate in viewer introspection accounts are no doubt provide a rich reservoir for empirical investigations of specific problems, but many fall prey to one or more of the following broader challenges. So, for example, the first one is what I call the problem of overspecificity. That is the dependence of the theoretical claims or justification on a delimited choice of artwork. So, for example, a lot of theories tend to focus on a specific art form, music or literature or visual art, or a specific mode of art. So, for example, figurative instead of abstract, or contemporary rather than traditional. And in some cases, the focus is even on specific styles of art. So, for example, surrealism or conceptual art. The second is the problem of natural and everyday aesthetics. How does one locate natural and everyday aesthetics, for example, in design, with a theoretical framework that prioritizes things like interpretive resolution, anticipation of insight, instability, and indeterminacy, because these are not really attributes of natural or everyday situations. The third problem is what I call the problem of inexhaustibility. And here is the idea that if aesthetic experience in art is located in a cognitive achievement, such as aha, erlebnis, interpretive resolution, understanding, or revelation, then how do we reconcile this with the immunity of aesthetic experience in art to repeated listenings or viewing? Why would one choose to return to an artwork if one has, in a sense, already got the message? And the fourth is the problem of individual differences. A lot of focus in theorizing has been on the distinction of the expert versus the novice viewer. But what about individual differences beyond this commonly addressed dichotomy? Why can different individuals at the same level of expertise often have vastly different viewing experiences? And most importantly, what differentiates the artist from the non-artist? I would argue that the challenges faced by existing theories are actually rooted in the fact that almost all theorizing has prioritized the introspective viewpoint of the art viewer. As art viewers, we often are confronted with artistic works that are puzzling, difficult, indeterminate, or confusing. So we develop a speculation that the primary aim of art experience is a cognitive achievement, whether in the form of an interpretation, explanation, understanding, insight, or revelation, or as a deciphering of a coded message that we think the artist is trying to communicate. But is this view reflected in the introspective account of the artists themselves? If we look at artists' own statements, the answer seems to be an emphatic no. Artists seem to consistently reject this idea of cognitive achievement. So, for example, Claude Monet said, "People discuss my art and pretend to understand as if it were necessary to understand." Or the contemporary artist Rosie Wiley says, "The painting isn't about something. I think lots of people don't understand that. They think it's the message, which it isn't. The message is the painting is the painting." And of course, this more famous quote from Gerhard Richter, where he said, "Paintings that can be interpreted and have a meaning are bad paintings." So I want to briefly mention 3 more examples of contemporary figurative art to highlight this tension between aesthetic engagement and resistance to understanding. I've deliberately chosen figurative art because if there was some kind of cognitive achievement in art that involved understanding, meaning, construction, interpretation, or revelation, then one would at least expect it to occur in figurative art. But we see in all these cases that any such cognitive achievement might be illusory. So the first example is a painting by Peter Doig called The Paris Wall, which is from the MoMA in New York. And what is central to the enigmatic appeal of this work, I think, is not some sort of narrative interpretation or understanding. And this is even if one has knowledge of the contingent facts of the depicted image, of which there are many. So, for example, the significance of the Le Paris cemetery in Port of Spain, Trinidad, the actual circumstances of Doig's initial photograph of the scene, the status of the individual depicted, what has been left out from the scene, and what has been augmented in this painting. Now, knowledge of these contingent facts, I don't believe add up in any way to contribute to a cognitive understanding. One can be drawn to Doig's image before learning these facts. And aesthetic engagement is unlikely to be significantly altered by their knowledge, at least in my case, especially in this case, because as in a lot of Doig's work, there is no sensible link among these facts. In the end, as Rosie Wiley says, the painting is just the painting. We see something similar in this equally enigmatic piece by Paula Rego, titled The Cadet and His Sister, that is currently exhibited at the major retrospective at the Tate. 2 seasoned art critics in The Guardian each reach very different interpretations of the meaning and significance of the image. despite both agreeing on the appeal and aesthetic power of the work. This points to the fact that even expertise doesn't result in stable or consistent interpretation and understanding. And the third example is a work by the conceptual artist and photographer Thomas Demand. And this image is from a series entitled Dailies. For those of you not familiar with his work, these are actually photographs of full-scale cardboard models of scenes that he has photographed on a daily basis on his iPhone. And here are a few more examples that I just wanted to show you of this series. The exhibition catalog for Dailies has a very interesting essay by the art critic Hal Foster, who tries to explain the aesthetic appeal and significance of this work. So for example, he talks about how these works evoke a mnemonic dimension buried in the trivia of our lives, or how he analyzes how they interrogate the space between two ways of seeing. I see the world versus the world is seen. What is interesting in Foster's analysis is how Demand's overall artistic project is amenable to post-aesthetic analysis, leading to interpretation, meaning construction, questioning, empathic feelings, and so on. But Foster does not attempt in the same way to understand a specific image, other than to draw analogies to other aesthetic experiences, as exemplified by what he has to say about the specific image, Daily number 11. So here, all he says is, for example, the aleatory strategies of the historical avant-garde are also evoked in the fallen seeds of number 11, or that the green seeds on the brown wood in number 11 call up imagist poetry inspired by the haiku. So I think what this tells us is that we may reach a post-aesthetic understanding of what the artist is doing in their oeuvre, but we have no understanding in any conventional sense of what the artist has done in the specific work. We can discuss the choices the artist has made, the technique, etc., that contribute to the aesthetic experience, but there is nothing of the aesthetic experience itself that is cognitively retained once we aesthetically disengage with the work. So what I'd like to do is put forward an alternative view of how we can define art psychologically. Now, this view agrees that mental processes can lead to certain cognitive outcomes, such as interpretation, meaning construction, understanding, evaluation, after aesthetic disengagement, but we must not mistake them as being part of the aesthetic experience. What I want to argue is that the characteristic of aesthetic and art experience itself is not a cognitive achievement, understanding, explanation, insight, or revelation, but a special type of perceptual cognitive state. And this state is linked to a special form of mental content, which I refer to as non-declarative content. So what is non-declarative content? Some of you are obviously aware that memory research distinguishes between what is called declarative and non-declarative memory. But the way I am using the terms declarative and non-declarative content is to imply a much more general and fundamental distinction in all mental activity. Non-declarative content, I would argue, is a fundamental part of mental function that in everyday experience is routinely masked by efficient mental processes involving declarative content. Now, note that the term non-declarative is not coextensive with the term non-linguistic or non-verbal, because as you know, some of the major art forms, such as poetry and literature, involve linguistic and verbal content. Now, there are some precedents to the usage of this, precedents to this term, particularly in philosophy, for example, in the term non-propositional content in analytic philosophy, which I want to avoid because I find it too restrictive in its particular usage in analytic philosophy. Probably closer to what I'm implying is the terms pre-objective content and pre-predicated content by Merleau-Ponty and Husserl, which comes out of the phenomenology literature in philosophy, which is probably closer to what is intended here. But I'm not entirely happy with these terms either, because the prefix pre implies a certain type of content that is present at some stage of cognitive processing and then not present at a later stage. So let me define non-declarative content in the way I see it. It is a form of perceptual cognitive content that cannot be categorized or explained in declarative terms, exists only in real time, in that it ceases to exist in the absence of external stimulation or internal simulation. It does not exist in memory in the conventional sense, and its storage does not contribute to the explicit knowledge base in the same way that declarative content does. And it exists in three specific domains: sensation and perception, emotion, and narrative. Now, I think non-declarative content is most intuitively understood in the sensation perception domain, in terms of a four-part structure of perceptual unfolding. We know, for example, that perception is based on a sensory perceptual potential that is activated upon external stimulation, and that there are spontaneous elements and modes of structuring that I'm loosely referring here to as entoptics. And these lead to the formation of gestalts and what I call proto-objects, leading to the eventual perception of recognized and categorized objects. What I'm referring to as non-declarative content inhabits the first three stages. But importantly, I want to argue that all four stages exist simultaneously in any perceptual experience, although mental focus in its default mode is directed only at the fourth declarative stage. What I want to propose is that there is the same four-part structure in the emotion domain, where we have emotional potential, emotion entoptics, gestalts and proto-emotions, recognized and categorized declarative emotion. And declarative emotions are the so-called basic emotions like anger and happiness, which engender efficacious behavior, withdrawal, or approach, and are easily communicated and recognized. Proto-emotions include complex and mixed emotions that do not engender a specific behavior and include emotions that we often associate with art, such as wonder and sublime, but many others as well. And when I refer to the narrative domain, what I'm referring to is that part of our cognitive function that automatically and unrelentingly ascribes causal connections and predictions to observed phenomenon, to build narratives of the situation, incorporating both immediate simulation and stored knowledge. I conjecture again the same four-part structure: narrative potential, narrative entoptics, gestalts and proto-narratives, and recognized, categorized declarative narratives, or what I would call closed narratives. I think the best way to get an intuitive grasp of what I mean by the non-declarative proto-emotions, proto-narratives is in nonverbal music. In nonverbal music, declarative content is entirely absent. Instead, the chord progressions, rhythmic and melodic structure give rise to what I'm referring to as non-declarative proto-emotions and proto-narratives. So I'm going to play this short excerpt by a piece by Jun Miyake, which I really like, which I hope helps you see what I mean by non-declarative proto-emotions and proto-narratives. So I'm just going to play that for you. Okay, I hope that gives you some sense of what I'm referring to. I think if you listen to the piece a few times, you'll see sort of the emotional depth of it, and also maybe see this aspect of what I'm referring to as a proto-narrative. But anyway, just to continue with this alternative view of defining art psychologically, I just wanted to present some of my main theoretical postulates. The first is that art aims at creating an aesthetic experience. An aesthetic experience is a state where mental contemplation is suspended momentarily in a purely non-declarative content. And art, in all its forms, is a medium for the creation of a space that achieves a stretching of suspension in non-declarative content, promoting aesthetic experience. Now, non-declarative content in the generalized context of aesthetics, that is including everything from art, design, nature, everyday experience, spans three distinct cognitive domains, as I've just mentioned: sensation, perception, emotion, and narrative. An aesthetic in the art context, however, includes a fourth domain, which I call meta-narrative. And this is the complex automatic narrative attribution that we apply in terms of innovation, originality, sociocultural, philosophical relevance. And this is particularly evident with experts. And meta-narrative content is obviously absent in natural and everyday aesthetics. So any aesthetic experience will engender a suspension in non-declarative content in at least one of the three domains. In the case of art, the most successful work engenders an integrated and sustained suspension in all four domains. So the question is this proposal consistent with the introspective account of the artist? I think so. I think artist statements point to exactly the sort of delinkage between declarative and non-declarative content in the art experience. And I think my favorite quote, and I think which best captures this this distinction or dissociation between these two in art is a quote by Robert Irwin, who, in referring to the act of seeing in art, says, "Seeing is forgetting the name of the thing that one sees." And coming back to Peter Doig, what he says when talking about his painting is, there is something primal about painting. They are totally non-linguistic. I am trying to create something that is questionable, something that is difficult, if not impossible, to put into words. And this idea that aesthetic engagement is a momentary cognitive state, as I mentioned before, that it's a real-time phenomenon rather than a cognitive achievement, I think is highlighted in the minimalist sculptor Don Judd's statement. And in this, what I'm showing you here is some examples of his work, but in the quote, he's not really referring to his own work, but is rather was discussing painting. And here he says, but I think that's a particular kind of experience involving a certain immediacy between you and the canvas, you and a particular kind of experience of that particular moment. So I hope that maybe starts giving a picture of where I'm going with this. And I can try to explain how this framework is able to meet the 4 challenges I stated before, but I don't really have the time. So instead, I'm going to go over a few examples that hopefully partially addresses them. But of course, we can come back to them in questions. So I think the first important thing to bear in mind is that in everyday experience and non-art images, our mind is oriented to declarative content in all the domains, perceptual, emotional, and narrative. And so although, as I mentioned earlier, the non-declarative content is always present. So here, for example, is your typical view outside a flat in Great Britain, here in Scotland. And I wouldn't call it a particularly aesthetic image. But if I sort of crop something out and show you that, I hope you see that there is the beginnings of some sort of aesthetic draw in this. Obviously, this is my poor attempt, but I'm trying to take the most mundane example to try to draw this out. And I think that this idea that is related to the idea that aesthetic experience can occur in natural and everyday situations when we're in a sense forced to mentally orient to the real-time non-declarative content. So for example, this is a photograph I took in Lago di Garda in Italy, and it was a case where if you were present there in person, there was just no way that you weren't put in that sort of same aesthetic state that you would in front of a work of art. And so just going back to art, and I talked about this idea that you have these four domains in which a stretching can occur. So if I were to discuss the Paul Arago piece, I would say that probably the stretching for me occurs mostly in the perceptual and emotional domain, perhaps a little bit in the narrative, but not really so much in the meta-narrative domain. If we consider, for example, one of these examples of Robert Motherwell's Elegy to the Spanish Republic pieces, again, for me, I think the strongest suspension is in non-declarative space of perception and sensation, and perhaps somewhat in emotion as well, but very little in narrative, and perhaps something in the meta-narrative domain. And of course, no talk on the question of what is art is complete without mentioning Duchamp's Fountain. And here I would say probably this intervention would suggest that the main place that it might engender an aesthetic experience in the meta-narrative domain. And of course, individuals might differ on how they experience this piece. In my case, I'd never felt like I had an aesthetic experience specifically with, and maybe that's not what Duchamp intended, but I would say that I didn't get that suspension in meta-narrative space either. But it was, and it might have been because I'm historically too late to the story. But anyway, I'll just end there, and thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Dhanraj, for this inspiring talk. I can see many overlaps with our next speaker. Oh, he is Fulvia Carnevale. She is a member of Claire Fontaine, a collective feminist conceptual artist funded in Paris in 2004 by, indeed, Fulvia Carnevale and James Thornhill. Claire Fontaine, whose name comes from a popular brand of French stationery, declared herself as a ready-made artist and began to elaborate a version of neo-conceptual art, and that often draws on pre-existing objects and artworks. Claire Fontaine, translated in English, means clear fountain, and can also be conceptually linked to the artwork Fontaine by Michel Duchamp, known as the most famous ready-made. So this is the most clear link with at the end of Dhanraj presentation. And Fulvia, I invite you to start your presentation, and thank you very much for being with us. I think you have to unmute yourself.
Yeah, there is some kind of inertia with the unmuting, so one presses again and it mutes you again. Apologies. I'm not a native technology person, as you can see. So I will share the screen. This, I guess, I tried before and it will work out. So thank you, Dhanraj, for ending on this note, because it's exactly, even if we had organized it, it couldn't have been better where I'm going to begin from. So of course, I'm going to give a very different perspective on this question of what is art, because I have taken it as a kind of personal challenge to define our practice, the practice of Claire Fontaine, in a way that is not arrogant, so to speak, because when you place your practice within a art historical constellation as an artist, you are in some ways placing yourself as the direct descendant of the people you're naming. You're saying you're as important as them. But actually the operation that we usually do when we quote other artists, when we quote as sources of inspiration, is pretty different. It's an operation that tends to make explicit the fact that there is no artistic genius without a deep connection to existing works or to an art historical knowledge of what has been done before them. And so it is, in a way, a way of giving a key to the viewer about the creative process that lays behind the work that is shown to them. I don't know if this makes any sense up to now, but I wanted to start with this picture. It's a picture from 1966 by Bruce Nauman, and the title of this picture is A Portrait of the Artist as a Fountain. So it's a picture that I kept coming back to.
Sorry, Fulvia, sorry to interrupt. I can't see the picture. I don't know if you're sharing your screen.
I am, wait a second. Maybe I'm not sharing the right screen. How is that working now?
Yes, that's perfect. I can see it.
Okay, sorry.
You can see the preview.
I'm gonna go to the full screen. So this is the picture. It's a picture from 1966, as I was saying, and the title is Portrait of the Artist as a Fountain. So Bruce Nauman has done a lot of performances too, even kind of sort of violent for the viewer and for himself. He was really into trying to give the viewer an aesthetic experience that would displace an existing content that we are familiar with, or an existing experience, into the aesthetic space, which is an operation that we also try to perform with our own work. So here he's presenting himself as a statue, a figure inside the fountain. But at the same time, he's quoting the Duchamp's Urinal that we just seen as the first ready-made. So from there, we have thought through this metaphoric gesture of Naumann, and we have elaborated this idea of the ready-made artist. What is, in fact, the ready-made? The ready-made is an object that has been deprived of its use value and elevated to the rank of artwork on the basis of the artistic choice. This is the definition that Duchamp gives of it. But it's also a kind of objection against the aesthetic criteria. So what Dhanraj was saying, that if you didn't have any transcendental aesthetic experience in the presence of the urinal, it's completely accurate, because it's not supposed to carry the aura, what Benjamin describes as the aura, although it kind of does. I mean, Dan Graham argued that the ready-mades do carry an aura, and when asked about it, Duchamp said, I would rather remain esoteric about it. I don't want to disclose this process, and I don't want to disclose the magic behind it. He uses exactly these words. So the quality that makes a vulgar object able to become a ready-made is the infrathin. The infrathin is something that Duchamp defines in many places, and it's something imperceptible, almost imperceptible, a quality that is undescribable. It says it's when the smoke that comes out of the mouth of the smoker meets the one that comes out of the nostrils, or when one sits on a chair and the chair is still warm. Anyway, it's a very, very subtle perception, and very poetic. It's something that unsettles you, and you can't really pinpoint, and you can't really verbalize. So Naumann didn't stop with that artwork, quoting the metaphor of the fountain, that then went into giving Claire Fontaine its name, her name actually, because we're a female artist, as you say. This is a work from 1968. This is the Portland Museum, the Portland Art Museum, and it's a work that says the true artist is an amazing luminous fountain, as you can see. Is made also a print on vinyl, on sort of plastic material with the same words. So the analysts, and particularly Cozy van Bruggen, have kind of dissected this sentence. They wanted to know where it came from, and she says that Naumann was a passionate reader, and he surely came across the writings of Rumi, the influential 13th century Persian poet. He was also a Sufi. Rumi was a mystic. And there is, in particular, one of the odes that is titled Become a Sea. And the text of the ode reads, every form you see draws its origin from the unseen divine world. So if the form vanishes, what does it matter? Its origin was from the eternal. Do not grieve that every form you see, every mystical truth you hear will one day vanish. The fountain is always gushing water. Neither fountain nor water will ever stop flowing. So why mourn? Your spirit is a fountain, river after river flow from it. Put all mourning out of your mind forever and keep on drinking from the water. Do not be afraid, the water is limitless. So this poem is absolutely splendid, because it points to another economy, another metabolism, another creative way of approaching life that is not based on scarcity, on responsibility, on accumulation, but it's focused on finding an energetic metabolism, and we will come back on this question many times, that self-regenerates itself. It taps into something that is naturally self-regenerating, that keeps flowing. And so in 1967, Bruce Nauman has a studio. He hasn't left the city yet. He's still in New York City, but I don't think he's living in a very chic neighborhood, because he says that in his neighborhood, even notaries and lawyers have neon signs on their windows to advertise their services. So he decides that he wants to make a neon sign. This is his first neon sign. He made many others afterwards. So he made this one for his window, and you can recognize Rumi's words into this sign. So to come to our own experience and our use of quotation and hijacking, in 2005, we hadn't shown any work yet, and we were invited to an exhibition, to make an exhibition in Berlin, in a place that no longer exists. Is now the bookstore of the Volksbühne Theater. But at the time, it was an artist-run space, and it was most of the time closed because nobody was sitting inside it to keep it open, and it was entirely surrounded by glass. I don't have a picture of it, but it's so different today that it would be sort of absurd to show it. So here we have used, not only we have changed radically the content of the sentence, but also we have used a technique which is a vandalistic technique that you can see in places that are enclosed but public. And it's burning with the fire of a lighter words on a ceiling. Naturally, the surface you burn onto has to be like parallel to the floor you're on. Otherwise, the flame won't go onto the surface and won't leave the trace. So this was a completely immaterial and obviously non-permanent work. It can be wiped away with a cloth. And I think, I mean, regarding the non-declarative and the declarative content, there is always a problem explaining works when you're the author of them. Although with Claire Fontaine, we have created this device, which is a collective device. So we have decided not to sign our own work with our names, because we dislike profoundly this idea that one should mirror oneself or extend oneself, one's own identity into what they do. You know, this idea of authorship as a branding, as something like considering the artwork as something that adds up to your own subjectivity. Of course, you cannot disarticulate this mechanism, but obviously Rumi's idea and Nauman's idea there, and the criticism that we articulate to the contemporary situation, take you to a place where being an artist could be something completely different, an experience also of the non-useful. You know, in the moment where the example of Dhanraj was very good, you decide to frame something and to exclude it from the frame of the ordinary, you know, to decide that this can be an object of contemplation because it's not useful, because it's not something, you know, not only you choose a ready-made, but when Warhol is painting a car, you know, and makes it unusable as a car, or we could give another ton of examples. There is a kind of magic process that takes place, and it is an interesting one, because one spends one's life enslaved by objects, and by working to obtain these objects, or desiring these objects, you know, or adding these objects to one's own personality, to the perception that other people have of you. And these objects are signs, even in their functional form. But using them, depriving them of their use value and giving them an aesthetic value is a completely extraordinary experience. So this work is from 2013. I remember the date precisely because we got a residency in the Wattis Institute in the CCA. We were teaching there, and we were asked to make an exhibition at the end of our stay, at the end of the semester. And Wattis was, which is the exhibition space of the CCA, was moving place. We already had an exhibition in the old exhibition space, but this new exhibition space was really monumental. It was an old factory, and it had very, very tall ceiling, like 10, 15 meters tall, I can't remember. And so when we first saw the space, we were really perplexed on how to use it, what to do in it. And then we didn't have a car, which in San Francisco is not very practical because it's a city that is full of hills, and we had a very young baby, so we were pushing the stroller up and down these hills, whatever we had to do. And at that point, one day we were like looking, when we were pausing somewhere to catch our breath, we were looking around and seeing all these vagrants, mostly of Latino origin, picking up the cans, the drink cans, you know, empty, and the cans of Coke and all these things, and putting them into these transparent bags to take them to what they call the redemption centers. So we were looking on the floor at what these people were doing, and all of a sudden we thought about actually the beauty of these bags that were filled with cans of drinks unused, or the colors of the partially crushed objects, partially destroyed, and we saw them on the floor, and we thought that they would be fantastic on the ceiling, suspended. And we also, by having that thought, we thought that a ready-made, after all, is something that gets excluded from the circulation, the natural circulation that it should have, and gets elevated to this other status of artwork. So for these cans, it was the perfect thing to happen. So we asked for help, and we went into these redemption centers, and we asked to temporarily buy some of these bags, as many as were needed to fill, as you see, the room that was given to us, which was a pretty large space, and suspend them to the ceiling, so the ceiling would be lowered. And so during this period of time, these cans that were trash became artworks. But also we realized that the redemption centers were places where, you know, had the name that talks about redeeming. And the pun of Duchamp, when he came up with the ready-made, the description of the ready-made was that the ready-made came from prêt-à-porter. So, and he had this pun that was ready-made, ready-made, redeemed. So he said the ready-made is something that has been redeemed. And so we didn't realize, we realized it afterwards, that we were reenacting, because there is also a subconscious memory of art historical images that inhabits us. So sometimes, most times, the quotes of other artists are not voluntary. We started building a homemade redeemer to melt the cans ourselves. This is a close-up of it. It has to be used outdoors. And then we were also asked to make an edition for the Wattis to finance itself. So we went to see in these factories what the material, the aluminium, once it was melted, looked like, and it was like compacted into these ingots. So we asked to to take some of these ingots to make with these bags of ours some ingots that we will get stamped and called redemptions. So in each bag that constituted the installation, there were 250 cans. and they were melted and transformed into this. For some reason it's struggling and it doesn't want to go into the next visual. Yeah, here. So this here it is. That's one bag with the cans inside. So we realized that Duchamp had made a very similar installation in 1938 for the International Exhibition of Surrealism. Here you go. These were bags of coal suspended to the ceiling, and this was a fake stove that he had made with a light inside. And it was called Ciel de Roussettes, 1,200 sacks of coal suspended to the ceiling on top of a stove, poêle. So in the end, I mean, we use also a lot in our work this diagrammatic representation on second degree, also as a kind of joke, because in the end, when things are described in a mechanical, in a distanced way, things that are part of everybody's life, trying to set aside empathy as a tool of understanding, there is often a kind of humoristic effect. This is a painting from 2010. But mostly we are inclined to include the body, the physicality of people in ways that are not direct, that are not figurative inside our work. So what you see here is a very iconic work by Duchamp, and it's a large glass that, as you know, has been broken by accident during a transport, and he didn't want it fixed. So the title of the large glass is The Bride Stripped Naked by Bachelor's Even, and all the elements in the large glass are sort of undecipherable. On the right-hand side, you see these things that are used by eye doctors, these circular forms for to check the focus of the eye. But in the middle you see the chocolate, the coffee meals. On the other side you see bodies. I mean, it's definitely an industrial aesthetic, the one going on in this work. And so in 1976, Anna Wilke, a feminist artist that is absolutely amazing in my opinion, she's left us an incredible legacy, activates the large glass in the Museum of Philadelphia by becoming this sort of bride, stripped naked. And here we see her in a striptease video that she shot clandestinely inside the museum, because she was a very young artist. She would have never been authorized to get naked inside the museum. It's a 10 minutes long video, and it's absolutely mesmerizing. And so with this sort of presence of the actual physical body inside this work, we started to think about our use of the light box, that we've done a lot, you know, and actually what is the new perceptions that we have today that people didn't have before. Like, for example, one of these new perceptions that has appeared in the past 10 years, it's especially in the past few years, since we all have smartphones, is looking at an image through a cracked screen. So being reminded of the physicality of the screen, you know, and not just as a tool that connects us to this dematerialized world, is actually something that when we crush it, when our body drops it, it breaks. And it's also something that is in constant contact with our body. We touch our phones much more than we touch any living creature in our surroundings, even more than a newborn. And so we started trying to photograph these cracks and see what was the result. And it was very interesting because we had two machines facing each other, the telephone and the camera at the top. And we did this work with a professional photographer. And then the results were absolutely incredible in our opinion, because there was all the physicality of the blown up image of the phone that one doesn't see when one looks at the phone. So there was the dust, the digital prints. It all became a much more, even more parasited experience of the image that one has when one is looking at it through the phone. So we were interrogating the circumstances of our perception of what is visible, and of course we recracked the large glass. This is not a fantastic picture, unfortunately, because the camera has a hard time capturing the light. So when something is lit up, it's very difficult to capture. This is another light box that we've created. This is also so as you see, the cracks are sort of irreparable because they're part of the image. They're on the same level as the image that is reproduced. They're indistinguishable from it in the photograph. But it's also interesting because one expects them sort of to be on the surface of the light box, which is now soft, because light boxes that were in Duratrans for years and were very complicated to realize now are made, if you find yourself in a closed shop or in an airport, they're made with a sort of fabric, like a vinyl fabric that is soft. You can touch them and you will feel that, because so you can take them off and swap them over when needed. So this one is a NASA image of the Earth. That is looking too hot already. And this one is taken from Giotto, the morning of the dead Christ. Of course, we have extracted one detail of the angels that are grown-up angels here. That's what is interesting. They're adults because it's the Middle Age and they are mourning something, but we don't see what that is. In this case, as the paint work is old, the crack looks like it's is appearing on the surface of the paint. So as you see under this work, there is a floor made of newspapers, because besides interrogating the circumstances of the visible, we also interrogated the circumstances of the exhibition. You know, the white cube and what it does to isolate an object and to look at it. And we've used these. This device of the news floor, we call it, over and over again, because I will show you where it comes from, and we also weren't sure that it came from there. We discovered it by accident. This is a picture by Robert Capa of that was also a nom d'art, you know, a name of a man and a woman working together that had chosen to use that name, but a male name that time, then was inherited by the man only when they parted ways. But anyway, to cut a long story short, here is Matisse painting in his studio, and so he protected the floor with these newspapers. What we were interested in this image is that all these paper that is used for drawing and the newspapers on the floor are the same thing, they're paper. But of course, one has an incredible value, especially for us, for his posterity, and the other one is just valueless. It can be put under the feet and used as a cover. But the other thing that is very disturbing, as James, the other part of Claire Fontaine, always says, is that the newspapers look completely contemporary when these drawings look really old. So the newspaper kind of forces these drawings into a dialogue with what was going on at that time. Now, we don't see the detail, but when you walk around the news floor in our exhibitions, you do see news that you recognize and that distract you. You do see adverts because the page of the newspaper is covered in different types of information, not only the information that you're looking for, but also parasitical information that disturbs your reading and attention. And so all of these material that is, by the way, copyrighted, is forced to talk to your artwork and transforms the perception that you have of it, especially if it's a piece that is on the floor, and forces you to talk with the world outside. How are we doing with time? Because I didn't check.
That's okay. You can go on. You have other 5 minutes.
I don't have so much to add, but I just wanted to get to this question of the conditions of perception. So when you are asked, and these are beautiful moments, to exhibit outside the white cube, then you can really question the perception of what is art and how do you isolate something from your normal perception and feel that this is art or this is not art. You know, where is the infra-thing? Where do we actually perceive it? How does it happen? So in 2015, I guess it was, we got invited by Villa Medici in Rome, the French Academy in Rome, to invest the gardens. And we decided that these gardens have a very disciplinary structure because there's some jardin d'agrément. You know, they have the vegetable garden on one side. Now it's no longer maintained, but they have all these very defined and separated spaces with bushes, and they're totally, you know, you can't even think of walking inside the green areas. You have to, and also they are surveyed. In the other time there was the Plan Vigie Pirate, so you couldn't get inside the Villa Medici outside of a guided tour, and unless you were a resident, you could not walk around the gardens on your own for any reason. And so we decided that we wanted to materialize the presence of the people that were not allowed in there and never would have been and never will be allowed in there. And so put washing lines around the gardens. And the installation was called Camp, to suggest that there was a sort of refugee camp around there. And it was very interesting how it desacralized the space. You know, although it's overgrown and slightly shabby, the space remains very, very connected to its prestigious function. And with these things inside that suggested a use value of the space that was different than the one that was originally meant for, the perception of the space was completely different. Also, in this case, with the two statues, it was very funny because the statues had these clothes on that were immediately perceived as clothes when one walked around them, because they entered a dialogue with these actual clothes that were hanging behind them. So it was also very funny because it wasn't very well organized by the administration of the time, and so the people who were giving the guided tours of the garden weren't aware that there was a temporary installation in them because it stayed up like 3 weeks, I believe, and so they didn't know what to say to the public. So we briefed them ourselves because we heard them talking at lunchtime and saying, "Why is this stuff?" So anyway, I think this is kind of a good sort of example, although what I'm showing you are not examples, but a sort of fragment of what we've done throughout these years. This is the most recent work that we have done, and so it's a work that we've done for a very strange purpose, and we've never done this before. We are truly uninterested in fashion and anything connected with it, but we are interested in what we call magic materialism, which is this science of the infra-thin. It's this kind of attempt to explain the connections between things, emotions, and the effects that some events and some objects have on us that science cannot explain. So this this occasion was crazy. I mean, in the Tuileries, Dior makes every year a catwalk for the ready-to-wear collection, and the other one is shown inside the Musée Rodin or in other locations, or they did also a catwalk in Versailles. They can access any space they want. So, and often there are museums, which is very funny. And they have approached us, which we thought was very courageous and very amusing, to make a sort of scenography for the models to walk through. So we had the practical challenges because we couldn't put much on the floor because they needed to walk around the space as freely as possible. And we had a really monumental space. This is the size of a stadium, of a football stadium. So we decided that we would build some sort of speech bubbles for them. So we would have the space activated by the passage, and we would use feminist statements that would have a sort of contrasted relationship with the women walking underneath them that are not authorized to show you because they're also copyrighted material. So this quotation comes from Carla Lonzi, that is an Italian theoretician that is about to be translated by Divided. I'm very, very pleased. I will write a foreword to this text. It's the first one of her text that comes out in English, self-portrait, but very soon the clitoral woman and the vaginal woman and Let's Spit on Hegel will also come out. This first one will come out in October, so it's really soon. So this idea of the clitoridian woman, I don't know how much these people of the fashion world were familiar with, or this is the title of one of our texts. This work is being shown in the next weeks in the Museum of the University of Mexico City, in an exhibition about motherhood and the Stockholm Syndrome. So here, for example, there is a sign that invites you to rethink the concept of feminine beauty as a convention, as something out of place, as something arbitrary, as something that you can see as having an appeal or not, you know, this objectified idea of what is beautiful that fashion works with. So this is to give you an idea of the space. We also addressed this emotional metabolism, what moves what kind of energies one should or could tap onto, what is through pollution, what is possible. And this is just the entry point to the very last part of what I wanted to share with you, which is this idea of the strike. This was one of the slogans that animated the latest women's strikes. So, of course, I mean, the form we've chosen for these illuminated words was the stencil font because it's the most, it's the emptiest font ever. It's the most aerial font you can have. There is many more empty spaces inside the letters themselves, so they look like they're lighter. They could fly above the head of people. This was the formal consideration. We didn't want them to feel heavy. We wanted them to feel dematerialized, these luminous signs, and they were actually, because they were shown in darkness. You see them now in the photo shooting. These were not the circumstances of the light they were shown. So we have developed this idea to define, to extend this idea of the defunctionalization of subjectivity that is present in this idea of the ready-made artist, or that we present when we talk about beauty, feminine beauty as a ready-made. Is this thing that we call human strike, and that is we've written an anthology that Semiotext has published last year, entitled Human Strike and the Art of Creating Freedom. And this idea of human strike just extends, yes, this idea of not making oneself useful the mechanism of daily exploitation, or toxic mechanisms of society, and establishing another system of values. This type of behavior as a form of struggle, this kind of resistance to the formation of one's subjectivity according to the obligations that are put on us, really owes a lot to the feminist movements that politicized behaviors that had to do with desire, had to do with preventing the conventions from reproducing themselves, that had to do with the necessity of women of experiencing their femininity in different ways, being creative with their subjectivities in ways that patriarchy didn't allow. And so I don't know if you're familiar with this word.
Sorry, yeah. I'm gonna just ask you if you can wrap up so we have a bit of time for the discussion. Thank you.
Of course. This is Lozano. I will just leave this on for you. And then if you have questions about this, we can talk about it later.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right, so yeah, thank you so much for your presentation, for both our speakers for such a rich presentations, and I can see there are so many topics you both touched on, but perhaps to kickstart the discussion, I would like to ask each of you to think about which are the concepts presented by the other expert that are relevant and resonate with your research and with your own practice. And perhaps if you had to think about a possible collaboration and contamination from the other expert, how would that look like? And perhaps Dhanraj, if you'd like to start.
Okay. Yeah. Well, thank you, Fulvia. It's wonderful work. I really enjoyed all of it. Obviously, it was hard for me to. I was just sort of getting engaged with the work, so it was hard for me to keep. Try to also keep track of concepts and things like that. And I guess what was interesting to me was that you started off with talking about works by Duchamp and Naumann and stuff, which to me, in a sense, the political or the social role is more closely tied to the art world itself, which I see in your work as being different. I think in your work there's a much broader dialogue or critique going on, which in my simplistic framework I would probably put within the narrative domain. And I guess I was curious because in several instances you did mention the word aesthetic, and you talk about there being an aesthetic, and for sure in your works, I especially like the clothesline one, and also the last piece with the illuminated lights, where there's such a powerful social cultural thing going on, but at the same time there are these hidden aesthetic elements in there which sort of all bring together and make it an artwork. And I was just wondering if you could maybe tell us something about how do those elements act as strings or rubber bands to the artist, in a sense. You start off with a space, and you're given the space, and you conceive something. And I'm sort of imagining these aesthetic elements as rubber bands, the perceptual stuff. Why do you select those colors? Why do you? I love the actual font style that you selected for the illuminated. All those choices are there, and at some level, the artists are very shy and sort of pretend that those choices are not there, and but they're there. And I'm just wondering, are those rubber bands that you're trying to stretch away from, or are they rubber bands that you're sort of gladly being pulled towards, because that is sort of I don't know if I'm making any sense, but
no, on the contrary, thank you for this question, because you hit exactly the nail on the head. Because we are right at a point in our work where we are, and here I hope I will connect with what you were talking about. We are coming to terms with a totally content-oriented reception of our work that is not only reductive, but it's penalizing for us because the content of the work, as you have noticed, is broader than the one of institutional critique or conceptual art criticism when there is such a thing. And there is no moral obligation, as a matter of fact, to perform social or politically engaged work, but we created Fontaine, and like Pessoa, creates these characters. This is what has visited us up to now. And so we have had these ideas within the frame of Fontaine, but it has been very depressing for us not notice these things that you actually instead notice. And yes, the choices are there because the fact of saying that the form and the content go together is not a coquetry. It's a natural reality for the artist, because when you're sitting in the studio, you realize if something works or doesn't work. And especially when you're sitting or rather standing and nervously walking around the exhibition space or the space that you've been given, you perfectly understand if the work is being made able to express itself, to deploy its power, whatever that is, or not. So we are extremely attentive to all these aspects. And of course, the presentation on Zoom and with images like that one normally does in a talk when you cannot give a walk through an exhibition, which is the best way of presenting the work, of course, is very reductive, because when you use photography, as I was saying, you use it knowing that what you're showing is already an object, the objectification of something. It's a specific reframing and presentation of something with its own history and with its own information contained inside it. So you decide of the definition, you decide of the resolution, you decide of many, many factors, of the levels of the color. And so these images that you've been seeing are also part of that. So of course, yes, it's all artificial the way all these things are presented, because the aesthetic experience of the work cannot be there. So also what I'm saying, as you underline, sort of parasites it in a way. It doesn't help you to be more with the work, but it takes you also somewhere else. So it is a very strange exercise. And I'm glad you pointed this out, because all these pre-discursive element or non-discursive element, coming back to the distinction you've made, which I think is extremely important, because it exactly unhinges the hierarchy between discourse as an explanation and the visual material as an illustration of something. Both of the elements have their own poetry, and they have to engage in ways that are, when we use text, we try to do this. We try to create the emotion through the context that hosts the text. I could give you more pertinent examples of this kind of work, but every time we can work outside the white cube, we really think of the luminous works, if they're text, as sort of subtitles for the environment. So it's something that adds something and takes away something from what you see at the same time. So
right, and I think that point at which you say, when you're in the actual space and you're making those decisions, that you feel that you've sort of peaked on the power that you're trying to get, and what the configuration is that does that. I think for me as a psychologist, it's interesting to find out what that is. What is that happening to an artist when that happens? And I think in your work, but even I think any of the examples that I gave of selecting the frame of the photograph, or choosing the paint, or yeah. Anyway, I'll stop there.
No, actually, I was so Fulvia, in the meantime, may I ask you to stop sharing the screen, so perhaps we can
sure.
Each other is a bit bigger on the screen.
I thought I'd done it. I thought you'd done it for me, actually.
Oh no, sorry, I can't.
Open share. So
that's
have you
great.
done it for me? Because you've done it before, so I trusted you for taking care of it.
Oh, sorry about that. No, sorry. Well, actually, on this latest point, And actually, when Dhanraj was talking about from a psychological point of view, that was what was interesting to him. I remember in your presentation, Fulvia, you touched about this, well, you touched on this idea of this magic materialism, and then you added that something that science cannot explain. So on this point, I was wondering, from your point of view, if you can expand a bit more, and if you actually think that there is something that actually a scientific investigation can't capture. However, I'm also aware that part of your work is also theorizing about your artistic practice. So I was wondering how those two things can coexist.
Well, yeah, the theorizing part in reality, as I mean, I hope it's not like that. It's not meant to be an explanation. It's just an expression with another means of the same problems or other problems that are part of our research. I mean, I really experience and live our work as a permanent research. And before everything, you know, when you are writing a text, you're presenting it, you're sharing it, you're giving it to others to respond. You know, so I think for me, the writing part comes from a very similar impulse than the visual part of the work. So it's no explanation, it's no. But there is, of course, text about magic materialism. You're right, and I do need to expand on this because we live at times of conspiracy theory and refusal of vaccination and whatever, you know, loads of questions that have become much more than a joke, you know, that come up in every conversation because there is a real crisis of epistemic models all around us caused by the situation of capitalism that has infected a lot of things, and also an erosion of the usual democratic devices that, you know, people cannot really do what they say they want to do on a political level. So this has an effect on their subjectivity that is really disastrous. The way they use their speech is not a dignified way because they're not free subjects, or they don't feel like free subjects. So there is this crisis of the theorization, I would say, the conversation about political matters or even perceptual matter, like people interpret situations, daily situations, in ways that are completely different from each other. And this process has been worsening during the past 10 years and worsening with the pandemic. So the idea of magic materialism, to come back to your question, comes from De Martino, actually, who's an anthropologist, and is somebody that we've been working a lot with. Like, we've been reading his work a lot. And in the magical world, which is one of his first texts, he talks about all these phenomena that happen to anthropologists when they visit indigenous populations or native populations, and they see things or they experience things that don't happen elsewhere or that they cannot rationally explain. And so De Martino works a lot around superstition and works a lot about the stories that are told in the south of Italy later on. But he says that what he is interested in, like Warburg, is exactly the same standpoint, is that the stories are true for the people who tell them. So these storytelling, these experiences of these phenomena that happen in a place and not in another, shape the perception of reality and transform the reality that people live in, make literally other things possible between them and the objects. For example, if we think of phytotherapy, you know, the way witches have used phytotherapy, etc., and the effects that this had, and the relationship that exists between people and what happens. So basically, when we think of the infratim, it is something that can be described with poetic examples or by default or with an elliptic sort of description. But the truth is that is a specific type of sensibility that one can or cannot develop to a certain level of perception of reality. And this, for example, in Duchamp is critical, that he develops this kind of attention through being lazy, through not working. He really specifies that he is somebody who doesn't work, who doesn't do anything, whose artwork is his timetable, you know, and it's definitely to do with a type of sensibility. So I think that in work that is digitalized, and I will end here, and where the body is so, how would I say, unexperienced, other people's body are not experienced as an usual presence, you know, as a normal, unfiltered experience. Magic materialism can also help reconnecting to our own body and to what happens between the bodies, because they're all energetic fluxes that happen. It's not a mystical definition at all. It really wants to tap into the materiality of the things that happen, but without a cold and dissecting attitude that will neutralize a whole range of perception.
That's a very interesting answer, and perhaps I have a little bit of follow-up, but I can see Marina has her hand raised. So please, Marina, can you pose your question?
Thank you very much. My question is for Dhanraj, I guess. I find your model very interesting and different from the majority of models in the psychology of art. So my question is about perception, emotion, narrative, and meta-narrative. Do you think they are independent from each other, or do they interact with each other? Do they differ from, say, perception and emotion in your model? Do they differ from perception and emotion we experience in real life, not when we engage with art? And finally, do you have any ideas of how to study these things experimentally, or maybe you already have?
Thank you.
Well, the last question first. Yeah, I'm just trying to start thinking about ways. I'm still sort of more focused on the theoretical model right now. So, but yeah, to get to your first question, yes, absolutely. Obviously, I think there is an interaction. I think that was what I was trying to say by saying that the most successful artworks, I think, integrates that suspension in non-declarative space across those across the four domains. Yeah, I don't think those are independent, because, for example, I think they're independent in the sense that they are modalities. I think that, you know, emotion is something that is, emotion is obviously linked to narrative, because narrative draws out emotion, right? If we have a particular narrative goes in a certain way, we have a particular emotion. If a narrative goes in another way, and by that I'm just talking about our everyday life, not necessarily in this more amorphous non-declarative space. But in our everyday life, you're watching a movie and you see a narrative going in a certain, it affects your emotions. So obviously, there are already internal connections between those areas. You know, obviously connections between perception and emotion, because colors can, and that's what an abstract. That's why I told you that that last piece by Robert Motherwell, I think, is emotional. You know, because there is just the use of the color black and the shapes and so on. So I think that yes, there is this interaction, and yes, it's tapping into the same processes that everyday psychology is tapping into, but it's the only distinction is really where in that hierarchy is the mental focus placed on. And the idea is that in art experience, the mental focus is, even if very momentarily, shifted into this non-declarative domain. And that's why you can have individual differences, because, you know, you can see a piece of work and it might just not do it for you, because you just don't get shifted into that, you know, you might, everything might be explained to you and you might understand everything, and yet you don't have an aesthetic engagement in that sense. And, you know, that's, I think I was thinking with Fulvia's last piece, you know, I could already see what it would be like to be in that space. You know, and I could see the choices, I could see the content, what the intention was, you know. So in a sense, I can, that's why I said that it's not just external stimulation, it's also internal simulation. In a sense, I can simulate and I might not be 100%, I might not be very successful, but I can sort of simulate inside myself what that piece was just from the photographs that I saw, and just that simulation itself can move me in that direction and can make me have this aesthetic feeling. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess regarding this point, this idea of art as meaning making, and I think it's linked to the last piece that Dhanraj you were quoting of Fulvia, and I'm wondering. Well, both from the artist point of view, but also from the psychologist interested in experience in studying the artwork. I'm wondering if there is, well, if for you, Fulvia, it's important the way your art is received, and it's that the intention behind the artwork is conveyed, and if so, would that be interesting to investigate how your art is received? Perhaps this was a little bit the question that I had in mind.
Well, I will go first if the question was to both of us, but I mean, I think it is.
And in a way that the question to the psychology would be how would you suggest that this is studied? So in a way that, as you were saying before, is not cold and scientific, but perhaps captures more the experience and the phenomenology of experiencing the artwork.
I mean, scientific for me is not an insult. I mean, I just think what De Martino was pointing at when the anthropologists were omitting some experiences they've had that were paranormal or not explainable according to our epistemological models. They were discarding them as self-suggestion or hallucinations or but then you had people walking on burning coal and their feet didn't get burned and they did not get burned, and then yes, you can come up with explanations, but then if you turn your head and you get distracted and you get out of that state, you do get burned. There was an example, I think it's Malinowski, I can't remember who reports this, but anyway, these are simple examples. So science is not, I mean, this is also science. It's seeing that these phenomena happen differently in this different condition, and why is that? I think this is, and that the urinal or other examples of ready-made do create an emotion in people and do reach some economic value and some status in culture, although they are just banal objects. It's not just hallucination. They are anthropologically verified phenomena. There are things that actually happen, and so we're inquiring into that with the most rigorous and passionate tools that we have. And regarding the this was just a precision in parentheses, but in bracket. But anyway, regarding the intention of the work, no, I think the intention is just a pollution, because what counts is what the viewer, Duchamp said, the viewer makes the painting. I think it's pretty much true. I mean, you can guide interpretation, you can give hints, you can explain things, and all of this is very important. I don't think it destroys the emotional impact of an artwork. I think knowing more is better than knowing less, personally, always, in everything. I don't think there is a kind of destruction of poetry when you know the circumstances under which things were done. Otherwise, I wouldn't explain the work at all. Although I must say it's not always a pleasant exercise, but I think the intention doesn't matter. I think the energy, the strength, I wouldn't call it the intention, because it's really tied to the subjectivity and to the fact that people have to admire you because you came up with this idea. And although it's true, it's a distraction, because it's not what counts. What counts is the experience that you, viewer, and the work create. We leave our work, we make it, and we leave it. It's without us. We're not there to accompany. And I had nightmares when I wasn't sure that the work was shown well, because you feel it's abandoned, that you haven't, you've done something, but you haven't accompanied it, you haven't helped it being independent, autonomous. And I mean, you can make comparison with motherhood, but it's worse, in fact, because the work can easily be damaged, destroyed, or deactivated by not being shown correctly. And people don't have the same sensibility as you. So my dream and my desire when I'm making work and installing work is that the work deploys its own power. Sometimes I'm surprised by the way the work functions or doesn't function. You know, I'm very surprised. Like, there is a work that we've made and that functioned fantastically in the studio, and then in the exhibition space it completely disappeared. People were stepping into it, or other things that you don't think much of, and completely, like, I was moved by when by the moment where the models walked under these signs, because I had no idea what a catwalk looked like, and I had no idea what this thing would be. And they actually did activate completely these words, you know, that were floating over them. Or I can give other examples of moments where we had one idea, but in fact the initial idea was completely irrelevant after the work was installed, because the work had established its own interaction with the surroundings and with the people. And we're not in control of that. We can just help it happening, but we're not, you know, we're not the controllers of the process.
Yeah, I just wanted to say there that I always feel like there is this process. It's a serendipitous process. It's not a there's some pre-planning, and then I presume, I mean, at least as my experience in design, it's you know, there's a it's serendipitous. You know, you stumble into things, right? But then the question, I guess, psychologically is what happens at that point of stumbling, like that distinction between, oh, I'm going to stop here, I'm going to concretize this, versus I'm just going to pass through this because I don't think it's there yet, in the sense, well, you know.
I don't know. I think my answer is that it taught me how to dismantle ideology, because there are some ideas that look great on paper, and then when you experience them, they don't actually work. So if you come up with this idea, you're really enthusiastic about it, and then you make it, and then you realize that first your relationship with the material doesn't work, or the technician cannot do this thing you would like to do. So this rubbing against the hostility of reality is a fantastic experience, because it's our daily experience, and it's not a compromise. It's just making things happen. If you don't do that, the thing doesn't happen. You know, but you might want to be in a creative process where you're completely in control of every element and you don't get any intrusion. And I have examples of this, but this is not our case. Also, we're two people, so we have to agree on stuff and, you know, and convince other people, each of us with our own means. You know, the challenges are high, and it's been going on for a while, you know, so, you know, it's there's a lot of things going on within our creative process that are not only what I'm telling you. I mean, if James was here, he would tell you other things probably, and this what I've been saying too, you know, and he has the total right to do, because he's also the author of all of these things. So the process is more interesting than I can explain, because I should explain it against myself, you know, like there is a part of this work that is also it's not self-destructive. On the contrary, it's self-liberating. It frees you from your chains of having to be the author and having to be. You're always responsible, of course, for what you show and what you do, especially for the failure. But at the same time, you can't own it in the same way as you would do if it was just your practice. So there is an element in it that we hope is an element of liberation also for the viewer, that is conveyed by the work, you know.
Thank you so much. And I think this conversation can go on and on, trying to unpack what is status and in artwork, and how much institutional approach of art can explain certain context. But I think we run out of time. And so I'd like to thank both our speakers for such an interesting discussion and very rich presentations. And Marina, I'm going to hand it to you to close the meeting.
Yes, thank you all very much. It was very interesting. And I just wanted to say that next time we meet next week, the 10th of September, to discuss how people cognitively engage with serial television. And I hope to see you all next week. And goodbye for now.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, everyone. Bye, Fulvia.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.